What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Active Self-Protection Extra. I am Christopher Bean with Tactical Advantage, and today we're going to talk about leverage as it pertains to grip.
Lucky Gunner is my recommended trusted provider of Freedom seeds for range or defensive use. In stock, good prices, and rocket fast shipping are why I go back again and again. Because of new guidelines, I can't link their site or say it, but you're smart and you can find it with a simple Google search. Stick it to the man by paying them a visit today.
So now we're in the next part of our series where we're going to talk about leverage as it pertains to the perceptual concept of grip. So the first thing I kind of want to walk through is what really happens with the gun under the recoil cycle. So we have inertial force under ignition going that direction, right? So probably the first thing we want to think about is getting a good part of our grip established with a strong hand in this area right here, as high as we can. And really what you want to try and do is get some bone behind there so the counteracting force isn't 100% relating to muscle and or tendon. So if you can get a little bit of bone behind that as you establish your strong hand grip, that's certainly going to be beneficial. So that's probably the easiest thing to think about, is the backwards motion of the slide creates kind of a lever point right around here in the gun. You know, this non-scientific, that could be moved around where the center of balance is, but let's just, for sake of conversation, say it's right here. So once that slide goes back, there's an abrupt stop that's going to want to generate force going in this direction from the bottom of the grip. So rear, so like so. So we have another counteractive force being generated by the inertia coming this way. So that's where you get a lot of like pinky pressure or ring finger pressure depending on the size of your grip. And that's going to do two things. One, it's going to kind of act as a stop from that direction of travel. And what it also does, as you establish pressure on these two fingers or this finger, depending on whatever grip you have, it actually forces this part of your hand up higher into the beaver tail or into the tang of your pistol. So if I come around like so, I get a little bit of bone behind the gun, like we already talked about, and just using some, maybe a torsion motion is probably the way I like best to explain it. And that in turn pushes this portion of my hand up into the gun as high as it can get. So a lot of times people just try and get as high into the gun as they can, but they don't really have solid contact or opposing pressure down here on this portion of the grip. And that's kind of, to me, much like shooting a shotgun and there's space between the shoulder and the butt of the gun. So any allowable space you give or lack of appropriate pressure allows that inertia to actually have a more compounding effect, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. So when I establish that strong hand, I want to get as much meat as I can in here, as high as I can, get a little bone behind the gun, not muscle. Muscle and tendon especially don't do really good with shock load. Bone does, especially with a relatively low shock load, but it's very abrupt. So telling your muscles to do something that quickly, the likelihood of it being reliable is relatively low. So up here, we want to counteract that force. Now here is a part of grip that I think a lot of people don't talk about. So the slide moving to the rear, locking and beginning its forward state of travel, what you see a lot of times under speed is low hits. So if we're looking at a target, boom, 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 boom. And I think a bunch of that is kind of created by we're putting or inputting a bunch of force right here on the gun. And as the gun cycles, as the gun goes forward, all this reciprocating mass at some point stops back in this direction under battery. So what that wants to do is all the spring pressure in your guide rod and your recoil spring, once it goes back into battery, there's a tendency to see a dip. So once it, whoom, all that inertial force that was going that way is now being counteracted by the spring within the gun and slamming it back into battery. So how do we counteract that? At least for me, where my hands naturally sit, at about center point of the gun, you need to think about some support right in here under the trigger guard. So what that does is create a stable platform here, so that 17, 18, 20 pounds of return force is counteracted and cannot do that. So you'll still have support and strong hand pressure on the back strap. However, the greater amount of stability is coming from right here. So that's one I rarely see people talk about. They're thinking about the action of the slide going to the rear and not the entire recoil cycle. So if you can put all those things together through the recoil cycle, you have opposing force here, opposing force here, here, and here. And if you can apply all those things and figure out with the mechanics or behavior of your gun what those numbers need to look like for repeatable performance, that's when you'll get a very consistent return to zero. So that's another thing to talk about with grip. A lot of times you'll hear about like, well, the gun is flat. So when the gun reciprocates, there's very little muzzle rise. Cool, that's great. But is that the most important thing? And if you can get it 100% of the time, I think it's great. But what you'll often hear with more seasoned shooters is a reliable return to 0 point. So say this is 0 point, this being adjacent with the muzzle, the recoil cycle happens, but the natural end state of the gun at the end of the recoil cycle is to be very close to origination point of when you started. That's a really interesting thing to think about, because all of that, if you trust it, doesn't necessarily become problematic. It's much like a draw to first shot, where how your dot drops in isn't necessarily the measure of a good or a bad technique. It's just a more of is it reliable in your application of the technique? And if it is, you can start polishing it and refining it. If it's not, you still have some rabbits to chase to figure out what's going on. So this isn't going to be a super long video. It's just an idea where in the first explanation in this series, we're really talking about contact, getting as much of you on the gun as possible. Now, this one's more about where do you want to put yourself on that real estate? And almost all semi-automatic pistols recoil the same way. You're going to have an area here, 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 and here going in that direction. And if you can perceptually conceptualize where all those forces are generated and when in the cycle, you can apply grip force as necessary to counteract that. So hopefully this is helpful. Next time we're going to talk about pressures. Where do I input larger portions of pressure in my gun grip? And I'll see you guys then. So with that, thanks for watching. See you next time.